They were thrown away in the storm. Two battle-trained German shepherds, once protectors, now broken, cold, and left to vanish in the shadows. No food, no shelter, just rain, fear, and silence. And no one came, until he did. A small-town cop who had already lost everything. His wife, his child, now faced with a mission he never expected, to save two warriors who had been abandoned by the world. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in loyalty. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe no hero should be left behind, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. The storm had rolled into Cedar Creek hours before sunset, turning the quiet Oregon mountain town into a place of rattling windows and hissing rain. The streets glistened under the amber haze of street lamps, water pooling in the uneven cracks of the road. Beyond the scattered houses and shuttered shops, the highway cut through the town like a wet ribbon, slick with rain and reflecting the occasional headlights of passing vehicles. It was late, close to midnight, and most of the residents were asleep, save for the few working the night shift, like Earl Whitman. Earl, 62, was the sole owner and attendant of Whitman's Gas and Service, a small, weather-beaten station tucked against the edge of the pine woods. Years ago, he had been a firefighter, broad-shouldered and strong, the kind of man people relied on when chaos erupted. But since the accident that took his wife, Marlene, 5 winters back, he'd grown quieter, his eyes carrying the soft weight of someone who had spent too many nights alone. Earl had the slow, deliberate gait of a man who knew the value of conserving his strength, a silver beard that framed his square jaw, and hands calloused from decades of physical work. He wasn't unfriendly, just cautious in giving away pieces of himself. Tonight, he was bent over the counter in the station's small shop, sorting inventory receipts, when the crunch of tires in the rain pulled his gaze toward the window. A silver SUV eased into the forecourt, its headlights slicing through the downpour. It idled near the side pump, far from the overhang where most would shelter from the rain. Earl watched as the rear passenger door cracked open. At first, he thought it might be a customer struggling with groceries or a restless child. But then a large, wet shape was shoved out. A dog, broad and strong, yet unsteady on its paws. The door slammed and the SUV rolled forward without pause, disappearing into the wet darkness before Earl could even register the license plate. The German shepherd stood frozen under the sheets of rain, his coat a deep black and tan, now slick and clinging to his frame. He had a powerful build, the kind of muscle earned from work, but there was a stiffness in his stance, like he was holding himself against the cold, or against hope. His ears twitched back toward where the SUV had gone, and his amber eyes, sharp but dulled by confusion, fixed on the empty road. Earl stepped out under the awning, pulling his flannel jacket tighter. "Hey there, boy," he called, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. The dog flicked his gaze toward him but didn't move. Lightning cracked in the distance, throwing the wet world into a brief silver light. In that flash, Earl could see the dog's ribs faintly pressing against his skin, and a faint scar running along his right flank. His tail hung low but not tucked caution, not fear. A semi-truck roared down the highway, sending a wave of spray up from the asphalt. The sudden noise startled the shepherd, and he stepped backward straight toward the road. Earl's gut tightened. "No! No, stay!" He jogged forward, boots splashing in the puddles, just as the truck's horn blared in warning. The dog froze, inches from the white line, and Earl reached out, grabbing a handful of wet fur at the scruff and guiding him back under the station's overhang. "Damn near lost you already," Earl muttered, bending slightly to meet the animal's gaze. The shepherd didn't growl or bare his teeth, just stared at him with an intensity that made Earl feel like the dog was looking for an answer he couldn't give. Earl noticed the way the dog kept glancing toward the road every few seconds, ears twitching with each passing car. "You waiting for them, huh?" he said quietly. The dog's head tilted slightly, as if the words had weight. They stood there for a moment, the rain hammering the tin roof above them, before Earl gently guided him toward the corner of the awning where it was driest. The shepherd lay down reluctantly, his paws stretched forward, his head lifted every time headlights swept across the road. Earl ducked back inside the shop, rummaged through the back for a clean towel, and returned to crouch beside him. As he rubbed the rain from the dog's coat, he murmured, "Need to call you something. Can't just keep saying, boy." His hand paused over the dog's back as he noticed the way the dark fur along his spine seemed to swallow the light. The way his presence felt steady, but cloaked in mystery, almost like he carried his own weather. Earl thought of the shadows cast by the tall pines at dusk, deep and protective, yet hiding stories no one ever fully knew. "Shadow," he said at last. "Yeah, shadow fits you." The dog blinked slowly, then shifted closer, pressing his head lightly against Earl's knee. Earl let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. In the distance, thunder rolled again, and Earl led Shadow further under the awning. Inside the station, the clock ticked past midnight, but Earl didn't feel the pull of sleep. He kept an eye on the road, half expecting that silver SUV to reappear, though a part of him already knew it wouldn't. Shadow stayed close, quiet and watchful, his body angled so he could still see the highway. Earl sat on the concrete step, his jacket pulled tight, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't entirely alone in the storm. The rain had eased by dawn, leaving Cedar Creek draped in a pale, washed-out light. The town was waking slowly, the faint chime of the bakery bell down the street, the distant hum of an early delivery truck, the smell of wet pine drifting in from the surrounding hills. The gas station's forecourt still glistened from the storm, puddles scattered like broken mirrors across the cracked asphalt. Earl Whitman pushed open the station door, rubbing at his stiff shoulders from the long night. He had dozed only in short bursts in the chair by the front counter, half listening for the soft shifting of the big German shepherd outside. Shadow was exactly where Earl had left him, settled under the awning near the vending machine, his body angled toward the road as if it were a lifeline. His coat was still damp along the spine, the tan markings dull from the night's weather, but his posture, straight-backed ears at half attention spoke of an unshaken vigilance. Earl stepped out holding a dented thermos of coffee in one hand and a paper plate with a peanut butter sandwich in the other. "Morning, Shadow," he murmured. The dog's amber eyes flicked toward him briefly, then back to the road. Earl crouched, setting a small bowl of water beside him, then tore half of the sandwich into smaller pieces, sliding them onto the plate. Shadow sniffed at the offering, took 2 tentative bites, and then turned away again, resuming his silent watch. Earl sighed, not with frustration, but with a dull ache in his chest. This wasn't a stray sniffing around for scraps. This was someone's dog, someone who hadn't earned him. Around 8, the station got its first customer of the morning, a blue pickup with a rack of fishing rods in the back. A man in a faded camouflage jacket hopped out, nodding to Earl, then paused when his eyes fell on Shadow. "That yours?" he asked. "Found him here last night," Earl replied. "Or maybe he found me." The man crouched low, hand out in greeting, but Shadow only lifted his head slightly before looking away. "Not much of a talker," the man chuckled, straightening up and heading inside to pay. Half an hour later, the first real ripple of attention came from a boy of about 10, who arrived with his mother in a rust-colored minivan. His name, Earl later learned, was Tyler Briggs, a wiry kid with a mop of sandy hair, a smudge of pancake syrup on his cheek, and a restless, darting energy that made him seem like he was always on the verge of running off. Tyler's mother, Angela, was tall and tidy, her face marked with the faint lines of someone who worked long hours but still kept her voice gentle with her son. Tyler spotted Shadow immediately and approached with the half of a hamburger he hadn't finished from breakfast. "Hey, buddy," he said brightly, crouching down, arm extended. Shadow sniffed the burger, took in Tyler's scent, then turned his head back to the highway. Tyler frowned. "He doesn't want it." "Not hungry for that," Earl said, smiling faintly. "He's got something else on his mind." By mid-morning, the drizzle had stopped and a light wind swept the smell of rain into the station. Earl decided to put something in writing for the steady trickle of curious eyes. He dug a thick marker out from the office drawer and scrawled on a scrap of cardboard. "Lost dog, German shepherd found here." He taped it inside the glass door, making sure it faced outward toward the pumps. It wasn't much, but maybe someone honest would come forward. A little before noon, a pair of tourists pulled in, a couple in their early 30s, driving a compact rental with out-of-state plates. They were dressed for the outdoors. She in a bright red windbreaker, he in a faded ball cap and hiking boots. The woman, whose name Earl caught as Danny, bent toward the awning, her smile open and warm. "Is he yours?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Earl replied. "Showed up last night soaked to the bone. Been right there ever since." The man, Chris, squatted at a distance, studying the dog with an appraising eye. "Looks like a working dog. Could be trained," he remarked. Earl nodded but kept his tone flat. "Could be, or could be just waiting for the wrong person to come back." Danny's smile faded at that, and she reached out a hand, palm down, careful not to crowd the dog. Shadow lifted his head, sniffed the air in her direction, but didn't step closer. "Poor boy," she murmured, then straightened and joined her partner at the car. The day wore on in a slow rhythm fill-ups, coffee refills, the scrape of Earl's boots as he swept leaves from the pump islands. Every so often, Shadow's head would lift sharply, ears angling toward the dark green mass of forest across the highway. His focus would hold for a few seconds before settling again, but Earl didn't miss the way his breathing shifted when he did it, slightly quicker, nostrils flaring. Something out there had his attention. By 2 in the afternoon, the sun was a weak disk behind a veil of cloud. Earl was out by pump 3, wiping down the handle when he saw it happen again. Shadow stiffened, ears forward, gaze locked toward the tree line. This time there was no passing car to explain it. Earl followed the line of his sight, but the trees revealed nothing. Just a flicker of darker shadow among the pines, maybe a branch swaying in the wind. Still, it put a burr of unease under his skin. He made a mental note to check the trailhead across the way before closing. Around 3, an older man in a battered green station wagon pulled in. He introduced himself as Paul Harkins, a retired postal worker who lived on the far side of town. Paul was tall but stooped, with a habit of speaking as though every word had to be considered before release. "That's a fine shepherd you've got," he said, nodding toward Shadow. "Not mine," Earl corrected gently. "He's between places." Paul's eyes softened. "Ain't we all sometimes?" he said before heading inside for a pack of gum and a coffee. By late afternoon, Earl was certain of 2 things. Shadow wasn't going anywhere on his own, and whatever he was waiting for wasn't coming from the highway. The dog had shifted only to drink or take a few bites from the bowl Earl refreshed every couple of hours. The rest of the time his gaze was fixed either on the road or on that tree line, as though something out there and something back there both mattered equally. The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of a crow's caw from the forest, and Shadow's ears flicked again. Earl stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame, watching him. He could feel the weight of the dog's patience, the stubborn refusal to give up a vigil no one had asked him to keep. And for reasons Earl couldn't yet name, it made the old ache in his chest deepen, not just for the dog, but for himself. He knew that kind of waiting. He knew it too well. By nightfall, Cedar Creek was wrapped once again in a restless, wet silence. The drizzle that had begun in the late afternoon turned into a steady rain as the sun slid behind the mountains, leaving the town under a curtain of gray. The gas station's neon sign hummed faintly against the damp air, casting a muted red glow over the puddled pavement. Inside, Earl was restocking shelves, listening to the occasional whoosh of tires on the wet road. Outside, under the shelter of the awning, Shadow sat exactly as he had all day. Alert, but quiet, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the reach of headlights. Earl was reaching for a box of oil filters when it came, a sound so faint it almost blended with the rain. A high, quivering cry, the kind that came from something small and afraid, though not quite helpless. Earl froze, head tilted, and listened again. The sound came from across the road, from the dark stretch where the pines stood thick and close together. He glanced toward Shadow, and his stomach tightened. The dog had already heard it. His ears were fully forward, body tense, eyes locked on the forest. Without so much as a glance at Earl, Shadow rose and stepped into the rain, his paws making no sound on the wet asphalt as he moved toward the highway. "Shadow!" Earl's voice cut through the hiss of water, but the shepherd didn't stop. He trotted to the edge of the road, waited for a break in the traffic, then slipped across into the dark, his shape swallowed almost immediately by the trees. Earl swore under his breath, shoved his arms into a heavy rain jacket, and grabbed the flashlight from the counter. The cold air hit him hard as he stepped outside, and within seconds his hood was soaked. He crossed the road quickly, boots splashing through runoff in the gutter, the beam of his flashlight cutting narrow tunnels of light between the tree trunks. The forest smelled of wet pine and moss, with an undercurrent of something metallic, old rust, maybe. The cry came again, slightly louder now, leading him along a faint game trail slick with mud. Branches brushed against his shoulders, shedding cold droplets down the back of his neck. "Shadow!" he called again, his voice low but urgent. Somewhere ahead, he heard the sound of paws on wet ground and then a low, rumbling growl that stopped him cold. Earl quickened his pace, the beam of light finally catching the glint of eyes ahead. Shadow's eyes, golden in the dark, standing rigid between Earl and something on the ground. The second dog came into focus slowly. Another German shepherd, but smaller and thinner than Shadow, its coat once a rich sable now dulled with dirt and matted along the hind legs. The dog's right front paw was twisted unnaturally inside the rusted jaws of a spring trap, the kind hunters used decades ago and forgot to remove. It was trembling so hard the chain attached to the trap rattled against a rock. Earl felt his chest tighten, not just from the sight of the injury, but from the way the dog's eyes darted between him and Shadow, unsure which one to trust. Kneeling beside the animal, Earl set the flashlight on the ground so its beam washed over them. "Easy, boy. Or girl." He leaned closer, male. Adult, maybe 6 years old, with a blockier head and a white patch at the throat. Earl reached for the trap, but the shepherd let out a sharp bark of pain. "It's okay," Earl murmured, keeping his voice steady. "We'll get you out." He dug into his jacket pocket for the small pry bar he kept for station repairs, an old, well-used tool with chipped paint along the handle. The trap was ancient, its metal pitted and slick with rust, but still strong. Earl wedged the bar into the hinge, pressing down with all his weight. The trap resisted, groaning against the pressure. Rainwater trickled down Earl's forehead and into his eyes. He gritted his teeth, pushed harder, and felt a sudden sting in his palm. A shard of rusted metal had sliced clean through his glove, cutting across the fleshy base of his thumb. Blood welled immediately, warm even in the cold. Earl ignored it, shifting his grip, and the trap finally gave. The jaws sprang open with a wet snap, and the shepherd jerked his leg free, collapsing onto his haunches with a muffled whine. Shadow stepped closer then, his body angled outward toward the trees, ears flicking at a sound in the distance. It was faint, a branch snapping under weight, too deliberate to be the wind. The growl that came from Shadow's throat was low and steady, carrying the promise of teeth. Earl didn't need to guess what it might be. In these parts, coyotes and the occasional wolf pack roamed the deeper woods. The new shepherd's eyes followed Shadow's movements, almost as if he recognized the stance. "Let's get out of here," Earl muttered, looping one arm under the injured dog's chest. He was lighter than Earl expected, the sharp lines of ribs pressing against his sleeve. Still, carrying him along the slippery trail was awkward work. Shadow flanked them the entire way, glancing back into the dark every few steps, his muscles taut. When they broke from the tree line, the yellow glow of the station lights looked almost like safety itself. Earl crossed the road with careful urgency, boots skidding slightly on the wet asphalt, and made for the storage room door. He set the injured shepherd down on an old blanket near the space heater, then knelt to examine the wound. The paw was raw and swollen, the fur around it crusted with mud and dried blood. Earl rinsed it gently with warm water from a jug, the dog wincing but not pulling away. Shadow stood close enough that Earl could feel the heat from his body, his gaze flicking between the newcomer and the door. "You've got yourself a guard tonight," Earl said quietly to the injured dog. He thought for a moment, then added, "Can't keep calling you boy, though." His eyes drifted to the manila folder pinned to the wall behind the counter, its corner shadowed by the lamplight. On it, in fading ink, was a newspaper clipping about a wildfire from years back, an article that mentioned a K-9 unit that had helped evacuate hikers from a canyon. The lead dog's name had been Ranger. The image stuck in Earl's mind. It fit. "Ranger," he said aloud, testing it. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, and though he didn't move closer, something in his gaze seemed to settle. Earl wrapped the paw in a loose strip of clean cloth, making a mental note to get proper vet care in the morning. He washed his own cut in the sink, the sting reminding him of the rusty trap's bite. Outside, the rain drummed on, but inside the little gas station, 3 figures shared the same pocket of warmth. One man, one watchful guardian, and one battered newcomer with a new name. The rain had eased into a light mist by morning, turning the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp asphalt. Inside the gas station's storage room, the small space heater hummed, casting a faint orange glow over the blanket where Ranger lay. Earl knelt beside him, a roll of gauze in one hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. His hands were steady despite the deep cut across the base of his thumb, now wrapped in a bandage that had already spotted red in places. Ranger's paw looked better cleaned, no longer caked in mud and dried blood, but the swelling was still pronounced. Earl worked with deliberate care, using warm water and antiseptic spray, murmuring to the dog in the low, even tone that had once calmed fire victims years ago. Ranger didn't pull away. His breathing stayed slow, though every so often a flicker of discomfort passed across his eyes. Shadow lay a short distance away, his body angled protectively, amber eyes tracking every movement. Earl's gaze shifted between them, and that's when he noticed it again. The thickened skin on the pads of their paws, like calluses from running on rough surfaces for long stretches. The rigid, almost perfect sit-and-stay posture even when relaxed. The way their eyes never settled, constantly flicking to every sound, every shift of light. These weren't just strays. They were trained dogs who had been somewhere, done something, and now carried it like an invisible weight. The station doorbell chimed in the front, pulling Earl from his thoughts. He rose, wiping his hands on a rag, and stepped out into the shop. Frank Dwyer stood by the counter, rain beating on his battered leather jacket. Frank was in his late 40s, a long-haul trucker with the build of a man used to wrestling cargo and the creases of road life etched deep around his eyes. He'd been coming to Whitman's Gas for years, always with a quick grin and a story. "Heard you picked up some company," Frank said, nodding toward the storage room door. Earl poured him a coffee, sliding it across the counter. "Two of them. One hurt. Other one found him in the woods last night." Frank's brow lifted. "German shepherds?" When Earl nodded, Frank's expression turned thoughtful. "Funny. I was down near Medford a few weeks back, heard some talk at a diner about a K9 training outfit shutting down. Accident during a drill, they said. Whole program scrapped, dogs sent, well, no one knew where. Maybe sold, maybe dumped." He shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Could be nothing, but those working dogs don't just forget what they were taught." After Frank left, Earl returned to find Shadow and Ranger pressed close together, Ranger's head resting along Shadow's shoulder. Every so often, Ranger would stretch his neck and lick Shadow's ear, and Shadow, normally stoic, would lean into it slightly as if drawing comfort from the contact. Earl crouched, studying them with a strange mix of pride and sadness. "You two been through something together?" he asked quietly. Neither moved, but their stillness felt like an answer. By early afternoon, Earl had pulled his old laptop from under the counter, a clunky, outdated machine with a fan that whined when it ran too long. He sat at the small office desk, scrolling through local news archives and police department press releases. He searched for every combination he could think of. K9 Unit Cedar Creek. German Shepherd retired. Oregon police dog lost. The results were either outdated or irrelevant articles about fundraisers, drug busts, or ceremonial retirements. No mention of a disbanded unit, no list of missing dogs. Earl drummed his fingers on the desk, frowning. Mid-search, the bell over the door chimed again. This time it was a woman Earl recognized only vaguely from town, a petite brunette with cropped hair tucked under a beanie, bundled in a green parka. Her name was Lydia Clark, a postal clerk from the Cedar Creek branch, always polite but brisk. She stopped short when she spotted the two shepherds visible through the office doorway. "Wow," she said, stepping closer. "They're beautiful." Earl told her the short version of the story, Shadow turning up in the storm, then finding Ranger. Lydia crouched but kept a respectful distance, letting the dog sniff the air in her direction before holding out a hand. Shadow gave her a brief glance, then looked away. Ranger watched her steadily but didn't move. "My uncle worked with search and rescue dogs," she said. "They've got that look like they're always working, even when they're resting." Earl nodded. "That's what I'm thinking too." Lydia smiled faintly, gave a small wave toward the dogs, and headed out with her package of gas station snacks. After she left, Earl pulled his chair closer to the blanket where the dogs lay. He reached down to scratch lightly at the base of Shadow's neck. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. Ranger's eyes closed halfway, the tension in his body easing a fraction. Earl knew then that whatever their story was, it had started long before the gas station, and it wasn't over yet. That night, as the mist thickened into drizzle again, Earl set 2 bowls of kibble and chicken broth in front of them. Shadow ate with the same measured pace he always had, pausing between bites to glance toward the door. Ranger ate more hungrily, but still with an air of restraint, as if unsure if the meal was truly his. When they were done, Shadow curled up with his back against Ranger's side. The room smelled faintly of wet fur and antiseptic, and the sound of rain on the tin roof above made the space feel smaller, warmer. Earl sat on the floor with them until his knees ached, feeling, just for that moment, that the loneliness in the room was less than it had been the night before. By the next morning, the sky hung low and heavy over Cedar Creek, a patchwork of gray that pressed against the mountains. A fine mist clung to everything: pavement, pine needles, the glass of the gas station windows, making the world look softer but no less cold. Inside the storage room, the small heater hummed its steady song, casting warmth over the two German shepherds curled together. Ranger's paw was still bandaged, but he was already trying to shift more weight onto it, testing it with slow, careful steps. Shadow stayed close to him, his gaze flicking constantly toward the front door as if he were listening for something Earl couldn't hear. Earl had been up before dawn, sipping coffee at the counter while combing through more articles and online postings. No matter how many different search terms he tried, there was still no direct link to explain how two trained dogs had ended up in the rain outside his gas station. Every dead end gnawed at him, but his stubborn streak one Marlene had always teased him about, kept him digging. It was around mid-morning when the low rumble of a diesel engine rolled up to the station. Earl glanced out and saw a weather-worn Ford F-350 pulling in, towing a small horse trailer. The truck door opened and out stepped a tall woman in her late 40s with a long stride and an air of quiet authority. She was dressed in a faded canvas barn coat, dark jeans tucked into scuffed leather boots, and her ash-blonde hair was tied back in a practical braid. Her name, as Earl would learn in a moment, was Sarah Mathers, owner of a small ranch just outside town. Sarah had a reputation in Cedar Creek for being both direct and fair. Years back, she'd lost her husband in a logging accident, and since then she'd run the ranch on her own, raising quarter horses and tending to a handful of rescue animals. She didn't waste words, and when she did speak, there was a measured cadence to it, as if she'd already weighed each one before letting it out. She spotted the two shepherds almost instantly, her eyes narrowing in assessment. "Those yours?" she asked, her voice low but carrying. "Found 'em," Earl said. "One showed up first night, other was stuck in a trap across the road. They've been here since." Sarah crouched near the doorway of the storage room, careful not to crowd them. Shadow stared back at her, unblinking, and Ranger shifted his weight but didn't growl. Sarah's gaze softened just a fraction. "They're bonded," she observed. "You separate them, you'll break something in them." She glanced at Earl. "Mind if I look?" With a nod from Earl, she stepped in slowly, her boots making no sound on the old linoleum. She held out the back of her hand, letting the dogs catch her scent. "K9 trained," she murmured after a moment. "Both of them. I've seen that posture before. My brother was a handler in the army. Dogs like this, they don't miss a thing." Her eyes moved to Ranger's bandaged paw. "You did that?" she asked Earl. "Best I could," he replied. Sarah straightened, brushing a bit of hay from her coat. "There's a vet over in Pine Hollow who owes me a favor. I'll call her, she'll come out here, check them over." Earl felt a flicker of relief. "Appreciate it," he said. As Sarah left to make the call, Frank's words from the day before replayed in Earl's head, the K9 program that had shut down after an accident. If these two had been part of that, it would explain the bond, the training, and maybe even why they'd been left behind. But the pieces still didn't fit neatly. There was something else missing. About an hour later, a compact Subaru rolled in, and out stepped Dr. Elaine Havers, the vet Sarah had promised. Elaine was in her mid-30s, her auburn hair pulled into a low ponytail, and she had the easy manner of someone who had been around animals her whole life. She carried a weatherproof medical bag in one hand and offered a warm, brief smile as she shook Earl's hand. "Sarah says you've got a pair of working dogs in need of a checkup," she said. Elaine moved with a calm, unhurried precision, kneeling beside Ranger first. She examined the paw, checked for deeper tissue damage, and administered an anti-inflammatory injection with practiced ease. "He's lucky," she said. "No fractures. The swelling will go down in a few days, but keep him off his feet as much as possible." Shadow stood close during the entire process, his body tense but not aggressive. When Elaine reached to brush back the fur on his flank, she found a faint ridge of scar tissue. "Old injury," she noted. "Probably from something sharp, a fence maybe. Doesn't seem to bother him now." She glanced at Earl. "They're in good shape otherwise, but these aren't ordinary strays. Someone put time into them." After Elaine left, Earl sat on the step just outside the storage room, watching the dogs rest. Ranger had his head on Shadow's paws now, both of them breathing in sync. The sight brought to mind a memory Earl hadn't touched in years, standing shoulder to shoulder with Marlene in the smoldering remains of a wildfire zone, both of them staring at the ashes of a home they couldn't save. Two people who didn't need to speak to understand what the other felt. That was what he saw in these dogs. Later in the afternoon, Sarah returned with a bag of feed-grade chicken breasts and a sturdy rope tug toy. "If you're keeping them here for a while, they'll need something to do," she said, setting the items on the counter. "Working dogs get restless without a job." Earl nodded, watching as Shadow took the rope first, giving it a few cautious pulls before dropping it so Ranger could take a turn. There was no growling, no jockeying for dominance, just a quiet, mutual understanding. By the time the sky dimmed toward evening, Earl had come to a quiet decision. Whether or not he found their old unit, he wasn't letting them slip away to just anyone. These two had been abandoned once. It wouldn't happen again. The afternoon had turned brisk, the wind sweeping down from the Cascades with a bite sharp enough to rattle the gas station's old window panes. Earl had just finished stacking a delivery of windshield washer fluid by the door when the familiar whoop of a police siren, brief and low, sounded from the highway. Moments later, a black and white Cedar Creek Sheriff's Department SUV pulled into the lot. Earl recognized the driver from around town, but had never spoken to him at length. Officer Jack Reynolds. Jack was in his late 30s, though the deep grooves etched into his face made him seem older. He stood at 6 feet, lean but solid, the way someone looked when they stayed fit out of habit rather than vanity. His hair was dark brown with a hint of silver at the temples, cut short in the no-nonsense style of law enforcement. His eyes, a stormy gray-blue, carried the heavy stillness of a man who had weathered something unspeakable. The town knew the story. A collision on an icy stretch of Route 14 6 months ago. The kind of freak accident no one saw coming. His wife and 6-year-old daughter had been on their way back from visiting her sister. Neither made it home. Since then, Jack had thrown himself into work, volunteering for late-night patrols, extra shifts, anything to keep from going back to a house that was too quiet. He parked beside Pump 2, stepped out, and scanned the lot before his gaze landed on the storage room doorway, where Shadow and Ranger lay in their usual watchful positions. His brow furrowed, curiosity piqued. "Those yours, Earl?" he called. Earl shook his head. "Showed up a few nights ago. First one came in during the storm. Found the other one caught in a trap across the road the next night. Haven't left each other's side since." Jack stepped closer, his boots making a muted crunch on the gravel. The moment he was within a few feet, both dogs shifted, subtly, shoulders squaring, heads tilting, not aggressive, but reading him the way trained dogs do. Jack stopped, his expression changing. "They've had training," he said quietly, almost to himself. Without looking away, he raised his right hand in a crisp, precise motion, a silent canine stay command. Instantly, both Shadow and Ranger went still, their eyes locked on him. A corner of Jack's mouth twitched upward, the faintest smile Earl had seen on the man in months. He changed the signal, curling his fingers in a come motion. The two shepherds rose in unison and padded toward him, steps measured but confident. They stopped just within reach, noses working the air. Jack lowered himself into a crouch, letting them circle once before extending his hands, palms open. Shadow sniffed first, then gave a slow blink, leaning forward just enough for his forehead to touch Jack's knuckles. Ranger followed, brushing his muzzle against Jack's other hand. "You're good boys," Jack murmured, his voice softer than Earl had expected. His fingers threaded briefly through Shadow's fur, then Ranger's. The contact seemed to pull something unguarded from him. His shoulders eased, and a faint warmth crept into his eyes. For the first time in months, Earl saw something break through the armor of grief that had hardened around him. "You ever work with canine units?" Earl asked. Jack nodded once. "Did a joint op with the state police 2 years back. Trained alongside their handlers for a couple weeks. You learn to read these dogs and they learn to read you. Whoever had these two knew what they were doing." A gust of wind rattled the station's sign, sending a loose paper skittering across the lot. Both dogs turned their heads sharply toward the sound, then relaxed when they saw it was nothing. Jack noticed. "Even off duty, they don't switch off," he said, almost with admiration. He stayed crouched for another minute, letting them lean into his hands before standing slowly. Shadow stepped back to Ranger's side, their bodies angled as if ready to move together if needed. Jack's radio crackled then, a burst of static followed by a dispatcher's voice. He answered briefly, confirming he was clear to remain a few more minutes. When he turned back to Earl, there was a different weight in his gaze, still the sadness, but threaded now with something else. "I'll be back," he said simply. "If you need anything for them in the meantime, food, betting, call me. I've got some gear left over from the state op." Earl nodded, watching as Jack returned to his SUV. The dogs tracked him with their eyes until he drove off, and even after the vehicle disappeared down the road, Shadow remained standing for a moment longer, ears pricked toward the sound of the fading engine. Earl glanced at him, wondering if the dog felt what he had just seen in Jack, a recognition that went both ways, soldier to soldier, loss to loss. The storm rolled in just after sunset, the kind that seemed to swallow the town whole. Rain lashed against the gas station's windows in relentless sheets, drumming a furious rhythm on the tin roof. The air smelled of wet asphalt and the metallic tang of a coming cold front. Earl had just locked the front door for the night, Shadow and Ranger resting in their usual spot by the storage room heater, when the low growl of an engine cut through the roar of the rain. He stepped to the side window and peered through the streaks of water. Headlights swept across the lot, illuminating the familiar silhouette of a battered black pickup. Earl's chest tightened, the same truck he'd seen before, the one that had brought trouble in its wake. It rolled to a stop at the far edge of the lot, engine idling low, lights still on. The driver's door cracked open, and a tall, wiry man stepped out, his dark raincoat plastered to his frame in the downpour. His hair was cropped short, the way military types sometimes wore it, but his eyes were restless and darting. From the passenger side emerged a heavier-set man with a shaved head and a thick neck, moving with the slow confidence of someone used to throwing his weight around. Neither wore expressions that belonged to customers. Earl's instincts flared. He turned toward the storage room, but Shadow was already on his feet, ears forward, body rigid. Ranger mirrored him, standing shoulder to shoulder, his injured paw held slightly off the ground, but his posture no less formidable. The two men began moving toward the station's side entrance, sticking close to the wall to stay out of view from the road. Earl slipped a hand under the counter and pressed the recessed red button, an old alarm system wired to a siren outside and a direct ping to the sheriff's department. The men didn't make it to the door before Shadow and Ranger burst from the storage room like a pair of launched arrows. The shepherd's paws skidded briefly on the wet linoleum before they hit the lot, the sound of their claws scraping against the pavement cutting through the storm. The wiry man froze mid-step as Shadow closed the distance in seconds, barking in a deep, resonant tone that carried both warning and promise. The heavier man raised an arm, but Ranger came in from the flank, his presence alone forcing the man to back up. "Call them off," the wiry man shouted, his voice thin against the rain. Earl didn't answer. He knew the dogs weren't attacking, just holding the line. Through the curtain of rain, the blare of a siren grew louder. A moment later, blue and red strobes lit up the parking lot as Deputy Claire Morrison's patrol SUV swung in, followed closely by Jack Reynolds in his unit. Claire stepped out first, the beam of her flashlight cutting across the scene. Claire was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail and a build that came from years of patrol work rather than gym training. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and sharp. "Hands where I can see them. Now." Jack flanked from the other side, his own flashlight in one hand, the other resting near his holster. The two men hesitated, rain plastering their clothes to their skin, then slowly raised their hands. Claire moved in, cuffing the wiry one first, while Jack kept his focus on the heavier man. It didn't take long for the story to spill. Claire recognized them from an ongoing investigation. Two suspects tied to an illegal dog trafficking ring that specialized in stealing trained animals and reselling them to underground trainers. The sight of Shadow and Ranger standing between the men and Earl left little doubt about their intentions tonight. As Claire led the wiry man toward her SUV, the heavier one made a sudden shift, as if to break for the edge of the lot. Jack was on him in 2 steps, shoving him back against the side of the truck and pinning him there until Claire returned. Ranger moved in tight to Jack's side, a living wall of muscle and intent. Shadow stayed with Earl, his head low and eyes locked on the two men until they were secured. The storm showed no mercy as the arrests were made, the downpour pounding the lot so hard it splashed against the bottom of Earl's jeans. The police lights painted the rain in sharp strokes of crimson and blue, colors flickering across the wet asphalt like something out of a fever dream. The 5 figures, Earl, Jack, Claire, Shadow, and Ranger, stood in the glare, their silhouettes framed in shifting light. Jack glanced down at Ranger, giving the dog a short nod of acknowledgement before meeting Earl's eyes. They knew what they were doing, Earl. Without these two, this could have gone another way. Earl didn't answer right away, his hand resting on Shadow's neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's breath. "Guess they're not just lost dogs anymore," he said finally. Claire stepped up, her coat soaked through but her expression unwavering. "We'll take these two down to the station, start the paperwork. I'll add this to the trafficking case. Could be the break we've been waiting for." Jack cast another look at the Shepherds. "They're staying here tonight?" Earl nodded. "No way they're spending the night in a kennel after this." As the patrol vehicles pulled away, the lot returned to the hiss of rain on metal and pavement. Shadow and Ranger stayed close, their bodies still humming with leftover adrenaline. Earl ushered them inside, closing the door firmly behind them. Outside, the black pickup sat abandoned, rain collecting in its bed, the scene already starting to fade beneath the weight of the storm. The morning after the arrests, Cedar Creek woke under a gentler sky. The storm had blown itself out overnight, leaving behind a crisp, clean light that bathed the streets in gold. The smell of pine was sharper than usual, washed free of dust and exhaust, and the puddles on the road caught reflections of a sun that seemed almost too bright for the events of the night before. At the gas station, Earl stood by the counter with a mug of coffee, watching through the front windows as Shadow and Ranger explored the lot with slow, deliberate steps, sniffing the air like they were memorizing the piece. Jack Reynolds arrived mid-morning, his cruiser pulling into the lot without the urgency of flashing lights. He stepped out wearing jeans and a weathered leather jacket instead of his uniform, a baseball cap shadowing his face. Still, there was a subtle shift in his posture, less guarded, more open. He had the look of a man who'd made a decision and was ready to see it through. Earl noticed it immediately. Jack crouched to greet the dogs, letting Shadow push his muzzle into his chest and Ranger nudge his hand with quiet insistence. "They're coming home with me," he said simply, looking up at Earl. "I've got the space, I've got the training gear, and maybe I could use them as much as they could use me." Earl studied him for a moment, then nodded. "They chose you already. I just gave them a place to wait." The news spread fast through town. Cedar Creek had a way of making things everyone's business by lunchtime. By early afternoon, the community had rallied in a way that surprised even Earl. Sarah Mathers was the first to show up, her truck loaded with a bale of straw, a brand new dog bed, and 2 thick leather collars. Lydia Clark from the post office brought a box of homemade peanut butter treats. Even Frank Dwyer parked his rig on the shoulder out front to drop off a heavy-duty rope toy strong enough for those 2 brutes. The impromptu gathering snowballed into something bigger. Someone suggested they make it official, an informal welcome home for Jack and his new companions. By 3 o'clock, the gas station lot was full of neighbors in jackets and boots, kids holding thermoses of cocoa, and the low hum of conversation warmed by relief. Deputy Claire Morrison stood near the tailgate of her SUV, holding a manila folder. When the small crowd settled, she stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Last night," she began, "these 2 dogs stood between a criminal operation and a man who's been a part of this community longer than most of us have lived here. They didn't hesitate, and because of them, we were able to make arrests that may shut down an entire trafficking ring." She opened the folder and withdrew 2 framed certificates, each with the Cedar Creek Sheriff's Department seal. "It's only symbolic, but we'd like to recognize Shadow and Ranger for their courage." The applause came quick and loud. Shadow tilted his head at the sound, ears pricking, while Ranger gave a short, approving bark that drew laughter from the crowd. Jack accepted both frames on their behalf, his mouth pulling into the smallest but most genuine smile Earl had seen from him. Later, as the sun began to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose, Jack loaded the certificates, the toys, and the gifts into his truck. Shadow hopped into the back seat without hesitation, Ranger following close behind. Earl walked over, resting a hand on the door. "You'll bring them by?" he asked. Jack nodded. "Count on it." The drive to Jack's place on the outskirts of Cedar Creek was a short one, winding past rolling pasture land still slick from the rain. His property sat at the end of a gravel drive, a modest single-story house with a wide porch and a red barn off to the side. The yard was enclosed by a sturdy fence, and beyond it stretched acres of open field that glowed under the dying light. Jack led the dogs to the porch first, letting them sniff the threshold before opening the door. Inside, the house was clean but carried the quiet of a space lived in by one sparse furniture, the faint scent of coffee and cedar, and on the mantel, a framed photo of a woman and a young girl, both smiling under summer sun. Jack's gaze lingered there for a moment, but when he looked down at Shadow and Ranger, something in his expression shifted. Less shadow, more resolve. He showed them the large dog bed set near the wood stove, the water bowls in the kitchen, and the back door that led out to the field. When he opened it, the shepherds bounded across the porch and into the grass, their paws sinking into soft earth still damp from the storm. Jack followed them, hands in his jacket pockets, watching as they raced each other to the fence line and back. By the time they slowed, the sun had dipped low, and the sky was a tapestry of violet and gold. Jack stood in the middle of the field as they trotted back to him, one on each side. The three of them stood there for a long moment, facing the horizon together. No words were spoken, none were needed. They were, in their own way, three soldiers who had each lost something, now finding a measure of it again. Sometimes in life, God sends us blessings in the most unexpected forms. For Jack, Shadow, and Ranger, their meeting was no coincidence. It was a reminder that even in our darkest storms, God can place the right souls in our path to heal our hearts. These two brave dogs were not just rescued, they became rescuers, giving Jack purpose again and showing an entire community what courage, loyalty, and love can do. In our daily lives, we all face battles, some seen, some hidden. But just like in this story, there are moments when a small act of kindness, or the courage to protect someone else, can change the course of a life. Miracles are not always lightning from the sky. Sometimes they are the quiet paw steps beside us, the friend who shows up, or the stranger who cares. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is never lost. Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more stories that inspire, and join us in praying for all those still searching for their own safe place. May God bless you and keep you in His care. If you believe in second chances, in divine timing, and in the power of love to heal, type Amen in the comments.